Good evening. Hi, Ruth. My name is Sally Frater, and I am the curator at the Ulrich Museum of Art. Thank you for joining us this evening for the lecture with artist Diedrick Brackens, titled You Will Look Back on This and Smile. Before we begin, I would like to thank Director Alicia Sanchez and Assistant Director Danielle Johnson from the Office of Diversity and Inclusion for partnering with us to present tonight's event. The Office of Diversity and Inclusion has its own roster of dynamic programs on campus that promote issues of equity and inclusion here at Wichita State University, and we commend the great work that they do and for their support of Ulrich programs. I would also like to thank the Ulrich staff for their assistance with the installation of Diedrick Brackens' installation, A Slow Reckoning, which is currently on view at the museum. Director Bob Workman, Operations and Financial Manager Vanessa Smith, Preparator James Porter, PR and Marketing Manager Jennifer Lane, Membership and Special Events Manager Carolyn Koppel, Registrar Stephanie Teasley, and Curator of Education Jana Durfee, as well as Curatorial Intern Alexi Berry and PR and Marketing Tai Bin Nin for all of their help with tonight's event. In his practice, Diedrick Brackens produces fiber-based works that take form as wall hangings, three-dimensional pieces, and installations. Often incorporating found objects into woven textiles, he creates deeply thoughtful works that explore the nuances of the human condition, touching on myriad themes that include language, representation, the body, intimacy, and sexuality. Brackens' multi-layered and textural works move beyond the scope of traditional textile-based practices to extend the field of weaving. Diedrick Brackens holds a BFA from the University of North Texas in Denton and an MFA from the California College of Arts in San Francisco. He has shown his work in solo and group exhibitions in venues including the Pacific Sky Gallery in Eugene, Oregon, the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco, the South Dallas Cultural Center, and the Berkeley Art Museum. He has completed residencies at the Joan Mitchell Foundation in New Orleans and the Long Beach Museum of Art. The artist is represented by Steve Turner Gallery in Los Angeles. Please join me in welcoming Diedrick Brackens.
Thank you for that, Sally. And thank you all for coming and having me here. So I thought I'd start out with the image that's been used for the publication of, or the press for the talk. This work was completed in 2013 while I was in graduate school. And at the time, I really wanted to make textiles reflective, and I couldn't quite. Yeah. Is that better? Yes. Okay, sorry. I really wanted to make textiles reflective, and I was interested in doing that as a gesture of resistance so that when the viewer looked at the work, they encountered themselves. I was really interested in that. And a lot of the works that I make, I see as portraiture or as bodies. So this particular work was sort of an abstraction of the way that I saw one of my friends. He is this fabulous, wonderful, articulate, intelligent, gay black man who goes into every space with confidence and brilliance. And I just felt like this was a way to sort of celebrate him. So in this work, there's the golden fringe, and hidden within it, there are 3 doorknobs. Thinking about those doorknobs as a way to, as doorknobs are, they were kind of portals, or they open to these possibilities. So this is pretty indicative of what my work typically looks like. And I wanted to show this work and then show a series of images to sort of think about how I get to this point, how the work becomes this in particular. So I'm inspired by a lot of different things, and one of those things is American quilts. So this is a Geesbin quilt by Arcola Petway. And she lived from 1934 to 94, sorry. And this particular quilt is a variation on a quilting pattern called the Lazy Gal, and it's from 1976, and it was her meditation on the bicentennial. So I was really in love with the way that this black woman from the South was thinking through and articulating her sort of allegiance or her way of thinking about America or Americana by extension. And this is another Geesbin quilter named Missouri Petway. Okay. And the quilt here is made out of her husband's work clothes. At the time of its construction, he had recently passed away. And she kept these clothes and deconstructed them and made a functional bed covering. And she is quoted as having said that she was going to take his work clothes and shape them into a quilt to remember him, to cover up under it for love. So I thought it was just this beautiful way of thinking about the ways that textiles, these things that don't last, that wear, that age, they really mimic our own bodies, and to use them as ways to think about death and mourning and love, as opposed to kind of a stone grave marker. And by extension, this is a panel from the Names Project, or the AIDS Quilt. Each panel in the quilt represents 8 victims of the disease, and essentially they are community driven, so the folks who loved these people would create the panel for their loved one. And so again, it's textiles really engaging with these ideas of life and death and celebration and decoration, things that are really exciting to me about the material, and that I think it's so well suited for. And this is a quilt by Elizabeth Roseberry Mitchell. It's an early American quilt, and it really, I think, is a precursor to the AIDS quilt that the maker of the AIDS quilt may not have been conscious of, but she essentially made this quilt, this graveyard quilt, to sort of think about and mark the event of death in her family. So this is before the rise of commercial photography. Like, you couldn't just sort of take a snapshot of the folks that you loved or mark occasions in that way. And she lost 2 children, one in their teens and the other as a small child, and they moved from the place that they were from, Ohio, to Kentucky, and she had nothing to take of these children with her to this new place. So she made this quilt and created a coffin for every member of the family and stitched them along the borders of the quilt. And every time someone would pass away, she would unstitch the coffin and restitch it in the graveyard in the middle. Every time I talk about that, I get a little, like, chill. And I think that there's something so potent in that, and, like, moving and lovely and kind of dark. But to think about having to work through this grief by actually making something or unstitching and restitching, there's just a lot wrapped up in that. Whew, okay, so brighter things. Other things that really inform the work are European tapestries. So this particular one is from the 15th century. It was created in Brussels. I believe that's right. But essentially, they are these highly stylized, very pictorial images. They're huge, and they're full of symbolism and color and gold and silver and wool and silk. They're just they have basically come to a point where they are they are like, you cannot assign a value to them that they are worth so much. They were bought by Rockefeller in, I believe, the 50s for, I think at that time, $1 million. Like there's 7 of them. So they're priceless, basically. So this is just another image of them. This is me going to see them in New York at the Met. I highly recommend going to see them if you haven't. Like, images can't absolutely do any justice to them. And the third sort of thing that I look at to create the work are African textiles, particularly from West Africa, and mostly strip woven cloth. So this is an example of what a loom would look like that these textiles are produced on. This is in Ghana. And this is a piece of kente cloth that is constructed. So after the strips are woven, they're cut up and sewn back together. They're full of symbolism and abstraction, and have been this thing that I've been obsessed with forever. So this is just an example of what my loom looks like, me at work in the studio. Materials that show up in the work a lot, things that I can find at hardware stores, cooking supply stores, and I mean, anywhere you might shop for things for your home really show up a lot in the work. So in 2014, I found this image in a book about African textiles called African Textiles. Pretty straightforward. But it completely changed the course of my art career. Like seeing this image, it's just a diagram of I'll give you the technical terms, a weft-faced and then warp-faced cloth. So essentially, it taught me how I could go from thick and thin in a weaving, and this is a very indicative of a lot of West African textiles. There's this shift between seeing the vertical threads and then the horizontal threads. I literally rushed out of the library, ran across town, got on a bus, got on a train, like it's very cinematic, to the studio to start weaving this. So I had been really obsessing about how to incorporate all of these visuals and these interests that I had from all these different cultures into one object. And I figured it out.
For those who can't see maybe the title of that one, could you read that for those?
Yes. So the title of this work is Holy, 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 and it's 3 different spellings. So holy as in church, holy as in hole in something, like a shirt, and then holy as in fully comprised or contained. And I think about this work, and here's a detail of that work, and you can really see what I was talking about of kind of, there's these moments where the threads that go horizontally really kind of take over and cover up the threads in the background, and then moments where you can really see these vertical threads. And then in this one, there's areas where it's unwoven to really think about this idea of the whole. What's a whole? What is a whole in a body? What's a whole in a textile? And kind of that meeting of all of that information. This work preceded that work, so in the span of maybe a month, 3 weeks or so, I these works kind of fell into existence. I just was kind of manic in the studio. But I was inspired by a quote from a Mark Twain novel called, I believe the book is called Pudd'nhead, and Pudd'nhead is a character in the book. And essentially, he has this moment in the book where he waxes poetic about watermelon. And one of the things that he says is to taste the southern watermelon is to know what angels eat. And I just thought it was a beautiful sentiment. And Pudd'nhead also happens to be a white character, and I think that there was this kind of upending these ideas of who likes watermelon and what it means to like it, and all of these things that I just found kind of fascinating, and at least in popular culture. And so that's where the color palette came in, and I was thinking about how abstraction could sort of speak and how to get the textile to convey these ideas of just through color and shape. And disclaimer, it also was made at the time that shortly after the Beyonce album came out. Self-titled album, Beyonce, track number 4, I believe, is Drunken Love. And so it was really thinking about this auditory thing and how to make it visual. Beyonce will come up 2 more times in this lecture, so just so you know. So for me, it's really important to think about how objects talk to each other, how they live together. I think about exhibitions sort of as poetry. Like for me, the objects begin to speak to each other and create a conversation. And so I think a lot about titles and naming things, that it could exist on a page without visuals. So this is one iteration of how things kind of live in a space. There's these funny accidents that happen as I begin to treat the exhibition space as the studio. The work sometimes needs me to like touch it and do things. And I was working with the objects on the floor, so I would take my shoes off and like step on it and like sew on top. And someone walked by and was like, "Oh, I love the shoes in this exhibition." I was like, "Oh, me too." So my actual shoes stayed for this exhibition. And I think that there are ways to nod to who the maker is and what sort of impulses are living in the work. So this is Bars and Stripes. It was the 3rd piece that I made with this new knowledge. And I was, again, thinking about how color and shape and these things could give you enough information to maybe understand what I might be trying to say. I love flags and Americana. I'm like obsessed with Americana in a like hate-love kind of way. And in this particular piece, I was really thinking, like, can I make something that makes you think about the prison industrial complex? So this little silver shape that goes across this textile is sort of like a chain motif or a daisy motif, depending on who's looking at it and how you're looking at it. So I make sculpture as well, and this particular piece, the weaving, was gifted to me from a woman who knew that I loved African textiles. She had gone to Nigeria and got this cloth, and she was kind of lamenting about how it was kind of a cheaper version of this African product, and that it has this shiny, silvery thread that goes throughout it. So she was like, she was sort of like, it basically is a throwaway. It's like not traditional, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, I think it's beautiful. It's great. Doesn't tradition change and grow and evolve? So I started thinking a lot about that idea and used it as maybe a pedestal or a prop for this sculpture. When we came in, there was a video playing of me sweeping with one of these kind of broken brooms. Brooms have had a lot of significance in my life. I have a mother who's Southern Baptist, but she's very superstitious. And we were a military family, so we moved a lot. And one of the superstitions that she grew up with was that you don't take an old broom to a new house. So we were like always throwing away the like cleaning supplies, and like the first thing you buy when you get to a new house is a new broom, because you don't want to sweep in the old energy or bad luck from your last living space. There's these ideas in African American communities, not ideas, but rituals of jumping the broom to sort of signify these ideas of marriage that are holdovers from slavery. And just like you don't sweep someone's feet because it's like taking there's all these things about brooms. It's just weird. It's not weird. I think it's lovely. But I think that I got to a point in my life as an adult where I was like, how do I live with these traditions? What does it mean to me as someone who doesn't have the privilege to marry at this time, like to think about and carry these ideas? So like for me, this kind of bending and breaking the broom was a gesture of like, I can just adapt. I can adapt these things for my life. So this piece was the last piece that I made in graduate school, and I really wanted to pay homage to the unicorn tapestries, but also insert myself into the narrative somehow. So this is strip woven, so each piece of cloth is woven on its own, and basically I had to try to weave it in such a way that everything would then line back up. But I emptied it all of this kind of super realistic imagery and sort of tried to render it in ways that felt true to like my understanding of the technology of the loom and to the techniques that I was using. When folks thought that unicorns were a real thing, the sightings were happening in India and in Africa, so I was using these kind of African techniques to produce this, at the time, what was thought to be this African animal, made it in black because it was me, and then tried to do these kind of things in the cloth that resembled flowers or vegetation or a rainbow. Yeah. So this piece is 6 foot by 6 foot square. So I spent a lot of time in school trying to make things that already existed in the world, and got to a point where I was like, why am I weaving Band-Aids? Like, I could buy a bandage. So then I went out and bought bandages to see if it would satisfy that like impulse to weave one, and I just was like, nah, I still gotta weave stuff. And I was talking about these things sort of being bodies or standing in for the body. So I, for a brief period, was working with synthetic hair as a way to make that gesture a little bit clearer that it was related to the body, doing things with the object to sort of articulate like a body. So it has this tassel on the side that I was thinking of as like this hand or like gesture of a body. And this is an image of my thesis show. So the broom showed up and the weavings and more sculpture. Being so obsessed with the process of weaving and these different textile histories, the loom started to come forward for me as like a way to think about the body. So this shape sort of mimics parts of the loom. I have the fabric running through it as if it's inside of the loom. But I also think that it was sort of a passage or a doorway that one could enter into a different space through. There's a close-up of the textile. More brooms. I kind of stopped making the brooms because I couldn't get past the Fantasia aspect of things. They always felt like they were dancing or like just doing way too much. So this is my first solo show after leaving school. It was called This Is Real Life, and I was using a lot of materials in the work that were coming from these kind of domestic spaces or meant to be used in domestic spaces like bleach and tea and wine to add color to the work, along with kind of more traditional dyes. Second Beyonce reference. So I had gone before this show open to see Beyonce in concert with her husband, and the show was their On the Run tour, but they played like a short cinematic thing before the concert, and throughout it just kept flashing this phrase over and over again that said, "This is not real life," and it was like shooting, and like they were constantly in danger and trying to negotiate these things. And then in the media, there was this kind of just rampant death, and it was the first time in my adult life that I really was conscious of seeing dead bodies on TV or on the internet, particularly like Mike Brown and Eric Garner, and just it seemed like there was this eternal loop of like blood and death and the ways that things were talked about. So I made this particular object is sort of a stand-in again for thinking about the loom in the ways that threads are measured, but it's also caution tape, it's also a police barricade, it's an A-frame sign, but it's evacuated of text, and I think I just got to this point where I was like, I can't see any more of these images or read any more of these articles or like speak these things myself, so I just kind of remove the place where you might see the words danger or caution written because it just felt so like this onslaught of information. So those Band-Aids. I realized I had to weave Band-Aids, but I wasn't doing it right at the time. So I started making these objects that were sort of a little bit more abstract, and the one on the left is Martel's bouquet, and the one on the right is And See What Happens. And I was trying to find a place to put the blood or the stains or the bruises that I was seeing out in the world into the cloth. So sometimes I think, the Band-Aid might be the evidence of blood, like a stain on a bandage, or it might be the wound on a body. And then I wanted to scale that idea up in thinking about kind of blood and these bodies and bandages. And textiles have this sort of inherent relationship to healing and comfort and safety. One of the etymologies of cloth is said to be a word klitha, which means a poultice. So I was really like kind of in love with Band-Aids at this moment and trying to figure out different ways to get across these ideas of blood. So all the purples that you see in this piece are yarns dyed with wine. And over time, when they're exposed to light, they start to fade. So I like this idea that the work continues to change in the ways that like we move and change in the world and hopefully heal. 1079 is a police code that's often used to indicate the idea of calling the coroner. I made this piece after Mike Brown's, I believe, it's hard to keep track of the events at this point, but I think it was after Mike Brown's murderer was acquitted. And I was really kind of meditating on that and just things that were happening in the world around this. This was sort of when the rallying call of I Can't Breathe was coming out. So if you, on the kind of mid left side, there's a handprint. There's some X's and kind of just these gestural marks that were done in bleach on the textile as it was being woven. So the bleach is kind of embedded into the piece. And I was thinking about bleach as maybe a way to think about cleansing or calls for purity, but not necessarily in this calm and pleasant way, but more of a caustic kind of burn. And as a counterpoint to these more heavy or dark or hard moments, I was, asking myself, like, what else is happening in my life? And this particular piece is kind of a portrait of my partner at the time. He was someone who introduced me to wine, and we went out into nature a lot. So I was really trying to invoke these ideas of these other dimensions that I saw in the material, particularly wine. Like there are these kind of romantic and moody, light moments that come with these materials that it kind of is constantly shifting the read. Untitled, I totally regret naming it this, or not naming this piece. But it was kind of one of the anchors of the show. And again, that Americana flag thing comes up for me. And I think it was maybe a meditation on how I move through the world and how I see sort of the American experience in all its beauty and constant renegotiation. So it's invaded with these kind of high key colors that come up a lot in the work that I think for me are about the urban environment and about that caution sign that you see, or that safety cone, or that vest, or in my case, some of the clothing you might wear. And I just think this call for visibility, I want to navigate the world in a way that I feel seen. But I think this piece for me was a picnic blanket, it was a bed covering, it was just this space in which one would be leisurely. And so here's another one of the sculptures that was in the show. Is It Noticeable? And I was using these sort of red and blue colors to think about kind of the ways that the light on top of a police car kind of transition between this kind of strobing red-blue, but the red here is kind of this oxidized blood color. So thinking still about these bruises, these ruptures. And from this work of having this kind of gesture of the back and forth, I started thinking about ways to bring my interest in quilting forward in the work. So this is a woven piece of cloth, but it's been situated to mimic a quilt pattern called the log cabin. And there might be disagreement even in this room, but there's basically been this long history that quilts were one way that slaves communicated with each other and with those who would help them to get out of the South and head north to freedom. There's been a lot of scholars who say that these things never happened and they're not true. But I mean, I think as an artist who is working in a medium alongside this kind of myth, it was really important for me to think about, like, well, what if it happened just once? Like, one person used a quilt to, like, embed information and move through the world to freedom or to security. And thinking about, like, my own modern life, how that might work, how textiles have information embedded in them, whether or not one reads it. I started making these objects. And so the titles of these two, I just took meanings that were associated with particular quilt patterns relative to that truth or myth, however you like to believe it, and use them for these two pieces. This piece is still really tied into these ideas about kind of this kind of spectacle of Black Death that was happening at the time, and the media coverage of such, and thinking about, like, my computer screen just seemed like it might as well have been, like, bleeding because of, like, this. I think this is also the moment when sites like Facebook started having autoplay videos, so you could just, like, get online and you would be confronted with a video of someone being shot. So it felt like I was encountering these things that I may not necessarily have wanted to or been ready to see, and I had nowhere to put that information, which is where the title comes from, thinking about this imagery that had nowhere, like, I couldn't process it. And I also at this moment started using red a lot in the work, or instead of having a blue stand in for blood or pink or the rainbow, I was just like, it is what it is. I keep doing that, sorry. Okay. So I think I oscillate a lot between really looking closely at the things that make me uncomfortable or sad or unsafe, feel unsafe, and these things that bring me joy and just bring me joy and hope. So I started looking at, and this was after living in Oregon, this, like, green, rainy, beautiful place, and the Bay Area also just full of a particular kind of nature experience, making these works that felt more like they were about the outside world and not the body, and a outside world that I think at that time maybe felt like a place you didn't want to be, because I kept seeing these videos of people being assaulted in the, you know, open world. So I was trying to kind of think about that space, and still trying to privilege quilting in the work. So while, again, it's woven, I was thinking about the ways that a quilt might be laid out. And also, for me, it was like a chain link fence. So this kind of nature out in the distance. This work is Lost Summers Here, Sweet, Sweet Control. I wanted to try to make the works more bodily. So in this particular work, which I don't have a close-up of in this, there's two zippers that meet in the middle, so that hole can sort of be enlarged or minimized depending on how you feel. And in the work as well, there's sort of these slits kind of hidden throughout it, so that as one gets close to it in person, you get to see this kind of fleshy, pinkish red hue in the back. So I was really trying to make it feel more like the body, or like clothing on a body. And these gestures towards the body, like this plastic hand off to the right-hand side of the piece, just for like a bit of comedy and relief. This work, Flag S&M, is sort of a meditation on the pride flag. And in the pride flag, the original pride flag, each color had symbolism. So that pink stood for sex, and red stood for health, and orange stood for, I don't remember what orange stands for right now. Yellow stands for sunshine, green for nature, turquoise for magic, and serenity and spirituality. So at a particular moment, after Gilbert Baker, the maker of the flag, decided to kind of scale up and make this a kind of a commercial thing that could be sold to folks who were coming to the rallies. Basically, the textile industry was like, hey, pink and turquoise are hard to make. Like, we can't do it. Which I think is weird, because that seems like, if I think about that time in history, I feel like there was a lot of pink and turquoise in like end of 70s, beginning of the 80s, so I don't know. But basically he says that the flag was taken down from the original 8 colors to these 6 colors that we know it as today because of industry. But there was something peculiar to me to think about LGBT movements without sex and without these ideas of magic, or and I think maybe magic is another way to say like joy or like achieving these impossible things. It just seemed like what unfortunate colors to lose. So this flag is woven in such a way that the 6 colors that feel muted are kind of behind this loosely woven white nylon, and the pink and turquoise are on the face. So if you were to flip this flag around, those 2 colors would be obscured and the other 6 colors would pop forward. So it was my way of trying to return these colors or acknowledge them as a part of the struggle. This piece is for my father. I love my father. He's great. But get in where you fit in was something that I remember him saying a lot to me when I was frustrated or like felt like an awkward teenager, like all kinds of things. And one of the things that a lot of folks have said about the work is there's something about it that feels like genetic coding in the ways that the blocks or stripes move through the work. And for me, this particular piece was supposed to be like a black rainbow on a green field. And I borrowed the colors from the Pan-African flag, which is black, red, and yellow, black, red, and green. And a lot of African nations use those colors in their flags. And I wanted to just think about this space of like, where does my race fit into my sexual identity? So I was trying to kind of push those 2 things together. And there's this kind of ironic quote on it about this idea of everything being lovely now. Like, yeah, we've made it to this point. Like, all these isms or things that one might, social concerns one might have, like, you can just like let that stuff go. It's fine. But to the idea of the work feeling sort of like genetic code or like DNA kind of written out, I had my father do a DNA test this Father's Day. That was his gift to me, I guess. Maybe I just was interested in knowing. And I think like the Black experience in this country in particular is so mediated, or like owes so much to these 3 continents, being Africa, Europe, and what am I missing? America. Americana. So I had him do it, and he ended up being 79% African, 32% of that was Ghanaian, Cameroonian and Congolese was 21%, Nigerian was 17, 9% Senegalese, he was 15% English, 4% Irish, and he was 1% Native American. Maybe. It had a maybe kind of written by it. So I just like this way that, like on maybe a literal level, like I could see how my interests in all these different things sort of amalgamated to my father in some ways. This was a piece that was in the same show as the previous couple works. So it's double woven. It's a structure that I've been really interested in, where you have a back and a front of a thing, and you can have an inside and an outside of a piece of cloth as one whole unit. And essentially what is happening here is there's these three sections, and in each one of them there's a big kind of felt kind of cowboy hat inside, and I've just smashed them flat and stuck them in the pocket and then kept weaving. It's supposed to be a representation of a packet of Trojan condoms. So you can see at the bottom, it's as if one has been maybe ripped out of there. There's a white yarn in the back and a gold yarn on top, so that on the back of this piece there's all white. And I was thinking about some things that I've heard growing up, and maybe as a grown-up, relative to black men and wanting to grapple with that in a weaving. But also it thinks about minimalism and sort of celebrates that history and maybe some of the folks who were using it and things that maybe have been said about them. That's all I'm gonna say about that. I think that weaving for me too is sometimes kind of, time is so inherent in the practice, and a lot of times the things that I'm seeing or encountering in the world come out at the loom. So this particular piece was made just prior to Prince dying or passing away, and it was at the same time as a rainfall, like a first rainfall in a while in Los Angeles. So there was these things that I wanted to sort of try to show in the work, which is where the little raindrops came from, thinking about the rain, but also maybe the sadness that was like caught up in the death of Prince. But I initially was making this work thinking about trying to combine pink and purple, or pink and blue, and hoping that visually from afar to kind of try to get the work to read as purple, but using those colors because they were traditionally gendered, and trying to think about this idea of mixing them, which made it all the more charged for me, I think, when Prince passed away. So this is Sleep Don't Come Easy, was also in the same show as these past few works. And at this moment, I think I was really trying to move away from Black death, queer death, gay death, or just these hard subjects. So I think the color started to change in the work. There was this more kind of ethereal or liquid thing happening that felt like tears or felt like rain. So I think there was maybe like a coming to terms or a healing thing that was happening in the work. So this is thinking about maybe how all those works were living together in the same space. So I work with the gallery Steve Turner in LA, which is where this show was, and recently, earlier this year, I did a group show with them, and I've been wanting to make rugs for a long time, because, like, why not? If I'm a weaver, just logically makes sense, but I couldn't ever kind of figure it out. So this is a collaboration with an artist based in LA named Amanda Ross Ho, and she works a lot with these sort of what's going on in her studio and these things that she's finding and enlarging. So we kind of negotiated how we were gonna do this thing by we would talk on the phone or email and say like, this is what I saw today, this is what I'm looking at, this is what I love, and I was like, I love Americana, which keeps coming up. So I wanted to make these rugs that sort of were these geometric abstractions that nodded to the flag in color. And she was like, oh, those are like the only colors that I wear. I have all these sneakers that I've been saving. So we really kind of felt this piece out as we made it. And to nod back to these process driven practices that we have, like I bought the dyes that I was using to make this flag, to color it, and we presented it all kind of on the floor in the gallery. And this is the second rug that we made. It has the longest materials list I've ever seen, maybe. It's like all this stuff that she bought in from her studio, and like we kind of thought about it and arranged in these more kind of formal languages to think about cataloging and diagramming and things like that. So this year I've started to, sorry that I keep doing that, move towards thinking about the body in these more literal ways. So for a long time I really thought on some level that abstraction could save the world, which I think is a very painterly idea. But I think something in art school, there was something about taking information and distilling it so that maybe it was available or not available to certain audiences felt very productive for me as someone who was afraid of what someone might do with my image or images of folks who looked like me. But I also saw this amazing film earlier this year called Moonlight that kind of celebrated a Black queer or gay experience on the big screen, and it just kind of got stuck in my consciousness, and I had to find a way to get it out. So I think about this as a man standing before the ocean. There's this moment of break in the weaving in the background that sort of has a horizon line that goes blue beneath it. He's in this bathing suit, and there's water on his body from the ocean. And I started thinking too about the ways that I collage materials within a weaving, and wondering what happens when I start to collage actual textiles. So this particular textile was created to live apart from that piece, but in the ways that I think about exhibitions of textiles coming together to kind of create a story, I thought I could just just collapse them into the same space. And then this is the work that directly preceded that object. Americana comes back, the red, white, and blue. I was trying to find ways to kind of push it back so that it wasn't the first read, by altering maybe the amounts of each color, mixing them in peculiar ways. But this was in a show called The Unhomely that was really thinking about domestic space and the ways that maybe domestic space and public space sometimes collide, and artists that were working in that way. But I just wanted to have these figures be at rest and be in these comfortable places, and so much of that seemed for me to be, I was able to communicate with these ideas of water. So this figure seated in a tub, maybe kind of like purging of all the stresses of the day. It felt like a nice way to do that. And I think that's my last slide. Does anyone have questions? Yeah.
Silly question maybe, but I'm so curious about the piece Untitled,
Mm-hmm.
because your title seems so important and kind of poetic as well.
Mm-hmm.
So was that just a momentary lapse, or did you really want at the moment to have an untitled piece?
So two of the artists who I really love are Jim Hodges and Felix Gonzalez Torres. And I think partly I was just having this moment where I was like, ooh, I can be Felix Gonzalez Torres if I like name it Untitled. And then it went out into the world and I was like, I shouldn't have done that. So after that moment, and I think there was a bit of like anxiety about it because it felt like the title piece of the show, but it didn't need to be called This Is Real Life, and I couldn't like come up with anything else, but now I will just agonize until I come up with something. Like no more Untitled. Yes.
In the exhibition that we have here right now, there's a lot of mirror services.
Yeah.
Textiles, and I wonder if you want to talk about that a bit.
Yeah. So the thing that happened for me, I think, in conceiving this exhibition and knowing I wanted to work with the mirrors is I started to think about the Nina Simone quote that she says, you know, artists absolutely must reflect their times. So I was like, oh, like I can bring all these things together if I meditate on it for a moment. So I started using the mirrors as both a way to think about the works living in like always political or charged or fraught environments, and that, you know, no matter where they went or when they were exhibited, like they could potentially like think about at least the folks who were living in that time and encountering these objects. And I wanted the experience in the gallery to be one where, as you moved through the space, you were always kind of encountering yourself, or this kind of flicker across the textile. They're always kind of moving and shifting. You know.
In those pieces, many of them, the mirror is behind an artificial type of fabric rather than a natural fabric like cotton. Now, I read something into that. Did you intend to have something in there for artificiality? When I'm looking at myself in the piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, materially, cotton has to be, I'm going to throw out an arbitrary 70% of the piece. But that other part of it seems to be the place where I'm able to play or like riff on things or improvise or use a material because it's shiny or because it is transparent, or it gives me more like of a quilter's effect than a weaver's effect, which in my mind I have like, I need to feel as if it's not just a weaving sometimes.
I really enjoy what I see are the flags in the always look away and never look away.
Yeah, thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about how some of the pieces seem or may appear less finished over time than others? Can you talk to the intention behind that?
Yes. So I've actually gotten really good at this, but I didn't do it today. I normally tell people how long the work takes because the first burning question is how long does the work take? So I think some of the like polish and unpolished or rough and you know, very articulated things are about that for me. So I don't want to be someone who makes things that are just beautiful. Like people come in and they're like, oh my God, this is gorgeous. So for me, those moments of like, I'm just gonna like tie this sloppy knot or let those threads hang out, or like, you know, there's a gap where there shouldn't be. It's a way to articulate or like get people to slow down and spend time with those like strange moments. Because I think if you just saw one piece, you're like, ugh, I don't know if he knows what he's doing, right? But I think in the scope, hopefully, of like a series of works, you get these kind of moments of high polish and craftsmanship, but then you get these ruptures that allow you to like enter the work and think about what it might be about.
On your loom, it looked like you had at least about a 4-foot loom. Do you just warp just the little narrow portions of it, and then you do each one of those individually, and then sew them all together?
Yes. So for this piece, it was probably 3 pieces on the loom for many reasons. But the reason that I use the strips for one is that the loom is about 3 foot wide. However, sometimes I want to make something that's 6 feet wide. So like cutting it into those little sections allows me to go as big as I want. And then on kind of like an aesthetic level, it puts it into conversation with these textiles, these West African textiles that are kind of pieced together. Oh my goodness. You know all the weaving stuff. I don't know. So I have a 10 harness loom and a 8 2/8. Yeah. Yes. I've been weaving for almost 10 years, like as a, I don't know, fully realized artist. I've always been a weaver. Yeah.
Maybe on the yard, those flowers,
Mhm.
are those bleach painted?
Yes. Yeah, so the textile started white, and then I dyed it, and then I bleached it.
How do you feel about using a machine or a computer program instead of sitting at a living and doing it?
It wouldn't turn out the same. I've I've thought about it because of course, it would save time. I'm also not that computer literate, and I think there's something about being able to like put my hands into the textile as I'm making it, and even interrupt what should actually happen. That adds something to it that I wouldn't get otherwise.
How often do you use down objects? Like when you said you use doorknobs, and then downstairs there was one piece that has a mirror that looks like it came off from, it's like curved, where maybe you made it that way or not.
Oh, okay. So the mirrors in the show are all laser cut. So as I said, I don't like technology. I've done this thing to be technological. Part of it was that I wanted to use that material as opposed to like a traditional mirror because of weight and fragility. Like I knew if I used real mirrors, they could potentially slip and fall out of the textile over time. They're so heavy. So I forced myself to learn how to use a laser cutter because I needed to use a laser cutter for this particular project. So it's kind of the same thing with found stuff. Like when I find a thing that like sends my mind spinning, like, oh my God, this has so many like, makes references to all these things that I'm interested in or I'm thinking about right now, I like force it into the work. Like I'll hold on to things for 10 years because I'm like, it's gonna be important one day. Like some of the fabrics down there in the gold piece in the back corner, I've had for at least 5 years, like just waiting. Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you.